Good morning. Good morning. I'm Peggy Gregerson of the Author Selection Committee, and I'd like to welcome back Yangsze Choo, who appeared on our Zoom screens during the pandemic. Her first novel, The Ghost Bride, was a bestseller and was made into a 6-part Netflix series. The Night Tiger, her second novel, was also a bestseller. In fact, all 3 of Cho's novels were bestsellers. That tells you something about her appeal. Today, we're lucky enough to have her in person to tell us about her latest novel, The Foxwife. Imagine this. You're a 5-year-old girl whose mother has taken you to visit relatives. You go on a picnic, and while the grown-ups are napping, you panic, thinking they're going to leave you behind. You run and run and run until you sprain your ankle. Now you can't walk at all. A fox appears and stares at you with his big brown eyes. Then he disappears as quickly as he came. He returns as the handsomest man you've ever known. And that's just the beginning of the magical ride into the world of Chinese folklore, a world that has existed side by side for centuries with what we Westerners call reality. Cho has long been interested in stories of foxes that have a habit of intervening in human affairs and who tend to be better looking and twice as alluring as humans. The New York Times called The Foxwife witty and suspenseful. The Washington Post added, "The Foxwife reveals something profound about humanity." Will you please welcome a writer who has captured America's imagination again and again with her unique blend of fantasy, romance, and adventure, Yangsze Choo.
Okay, well, thank you very much for having me. And thank you to the Pasadena Literary Alliance and to all the committee members. I'm just so tickled and grateful to be here today. And can you all hear me by any chance? Yay, okay, great. Well, people often ask me why I became a writer. And I must confess that I fell into writing rather accidentally. I never meant to be an author, and I really actually enjoyed listening to Sochi just now because so many things about that just resonated with me. But what I was, first of all, was an avid reader. When I was a child, before ebooks and the internet, I was the sort of kid who was always carrying a book around. So we were only allowed to borrow 2 books at a time from the school library, and I rationed them. I don't know if any of you had to do this as well. And when I ran out, I would desperately start reading the backs of cornflake boxes, shopping lists, Victorian novels, and ancient copies of Reader's Digest. I had a lot of experience reading stuff that I wasn't particularly interested in. And as a result, I started writing the sort of stories that I wanted to read. For example, I've always been fascinated by strange tales, odd things that happened, and make you want to find out more. My first novel, for example, The Ghost Bride, actually began because I was down in the National Archives researching old Malaysian newspapers. I was actually researching elephants, but that's another story. When I happened to read the following sentence, those of you who can remember what microfiche was like, it's like, you go down to some basement and then you reverse around and you can't help but reading the articles next to the one you're looking for. And I read the following sentence: "The incidence of spirit marriage amongst the Chinese has declined." And it was so matter of fact that I was taken aback. And I wondered, what is this about? And then I realized that, oh, this is the marriage of the dead. And I'd heard about this as a child. It is a very rare occurrence. You know, normally the dead marry the dead. Once in a while, the dead marry the living. And I wondered, who does this and why would it happen? And so I had a sudden thought which turned into the plot of my first book. A young woman in 1890s colonial Malaya receives an offer of marriage from the son of the richest family in town. And the only problem is he's dead. So you see, for me at least, writing stories is very much about why and how and who done it. It's a raging curiosity that led me to write the sort of book that I wanted to read. Now, of course, not everyone is going to have the same taste, which is a good thing, I think. For example, there are many books that I love that other people might not enjoy. And that's why I'm always so honored and grateful that anyone has read my books at all, because there are thousands, or maybe tens of thousands, of really good books to read. As I mentioned, I'm an avid reader myself, and whenever I'm at a literary event like this, I'm usually queuing up at some other author's booth, saying things like, "Could you sign my book?" And "Why did this happen in chapter 5?" And then usually my publisher has to come and tell me, like, "Please go back to your own booth." But the journey from reading books to actually writing one was not one that I planned. In fact, when I was in university, I didn't take a single creative writing class. I was very worried about getting a job after I graduated so that I could pay off my student loans. And to be honest, if you want to be in the arts, most of us need a day job. You know, I sometimes give talks at schools, and kids always ask me, what is it like to be an author? And I always tell them, if you want to be a sculptor or a poet or a musician, you probably need a day job because someone in the family needs health insurance. And the kids always go, ah. So I had a day job for many years. I worked a corporate job with lots of financial spreadsheets. And in fact, the first thing I bought with my first paycheck was actually a leather briefcase. Yes, I'm so old that I come from the dinosaur days before everyone had laptop backpacks. And what I kept in that briefcase, besides snacks in, those old school manila folders, and yes, my gigantic 25-pound laptop, was books. Those were the days, as I mentioned before, e-readers were common, and so I was still lugging around physical books from the library to all kinds of places so I could read in my spare time in the parking lots of client offices. At lunchtime, they'd be like, "Where's your colleague?" I say, "I was in my car reading." And during late night business trips. And what I loved about the best books was that they transported me to a different world. That experience is what I try to bring to my own writing. I've always felt that the best books are like falling into a dream, somebody else's dream, with vivid colors and emotions. The world of the book has to feel real because, especially in historical fiction, if you get details wrong, the dream shakes and the reader falls out of it. You've probably had that feeling of, wait a moment, the Mongol siege of Kaifeng happened in 1232, not 1532? Or maybe not. But you understand that moment of disruption when the spell of the book and the story that you are living in breaks. So in the best stories, as a reader, you feel like you're inhabiting a different time, a different body. And that is the amazing quality of fiction. But it's not easy to do. Although I didn't take any creative writing classes at university, I did write in my spare time, mostly short fiction. So I actually never thought I would be able to write a novel. I believe it is the human impulse to create, whether it's playing music, planting vegetables, or cross stitching subversive slogans on your motorcycle jacket. The work of our hands is enormously satisfying. And if nobody else is around to admire the giant cabbage that you have grown, you will still be filled with joy. So it was for me with writing. I wrote some terrible short stories, mostly pastiches of authors that I admired, like Chekhov, and about subjects I didn't know anything about. I still remember when I was 21, I wrote a short story from the point of view of a 65-year-old Swedish man. My mother read it and very kindly told me, "You can't write this story. You haven't lived long enough." And I was actually very grateful for this blunt feedback. My mum has lots of opinions on my books. And so when I wrote The Ghost Bride, she said, "Why are you writing about dead people? Why don't you write something cheerful?" And when I wrote The Night Tiger, she said, why are you researching man-eating tigers? And then when I wrote The Foxwife, she said, "Oh, no more ghosts." By the way, last year I was actually in Malaysia doing a book tour, and I totally forgot that my parents were sitting in the front row. While I was telling these stories and various other stories about them, and I looked over and I was like, "Oh, I forgot about them." But luckily, luckily both my parents have great senses of humor, or one would hope. But going back to why and what I've been writing, it comes back to the stories that I myself wanted to read. Stories that make you ask why and what happens next. The strange tales of creatures that come at dusk and the complicated tangle of longing and the wonder that they bring. In fact, my latest novel, The Foxwife, came out exactly because of this. When I was a child, I read a lot of stories by Po Songling, a Qing dynasty scholar. He actually did very badly in the imperial exams and never got an official title. What he is famous for, however, is compiling a book of 500 strange tales concerning ghosts, the afterlife, and of course, foxes. These foxes are not the regular sort of animal, but the shapeshifters of Chinese, Korean, and Japanese literature who can turn themselves into beautiful women and handsome men. Wily tricksters, they will steal your heart, as well as any money or gold wine cups that you happen to have lying around. And these tales were written as supposed histories. For example, in such a year, in a certain town, this happened. And it was like the twilight zone of 17th century China. As a child, I was fascinated by them. And so when I told my editor that I was writing a book about foxes, she said, "Please don't tell me that this is a book about talking animals." And I had to reassure her that no, it wasn't like Watership Down. The foxes look like people. And since I was also raised on a steady diet of Agatha Christie and P.D. James, I couldn't help but turn it into a detective novel as well. So I must confess here that I don't plan out my books. And this is to my own detriment. If only I were more organized, I often think, I would be far less prone to staring out of the window instead of writing, wondering if that squirrel will manage to jump from the tree to the fence. And the image of a squirrel leaping precariously is actually similar to how I begin writing a novel. I'm struck by an idea, and like a squirrel, I leap towards the unknown. And when things are going well, I can often write the first chapter in 1 or 2 sittings, the opening scene unfurling rapidly, so I rush to write it down. sometimes in the middle of working on something completely different. And that's what happened with The Fox Wife. I wrote down the first sentence of this book. Perhaps you know this story. As you see, this is the classic Chinese fox tale. A beautiful woman comes knocking on a scholar's door while he's studying for the exams. He lets her in, they have a passionate affair, and then he discovers that she's not actually human. And by the way, often thought this is a male fantasy. There you are, like busy studying, and somebody comes to seduce you. It's totally not my fault. so, but this, of course, led to all sorts of questions on my end, including what were these creatures up to? Why did they always come and interrupt other people's exams? And all these stories are, of course, told from a human point of view. But I wondered about the secret lives of foxes, these mysterious supporting characters who came at dusk to meddle in our lives. And it struck me that it might be fun to hear this tale told from the fox's point of view. A fox with many opinions who disrupts the traditional account by pointing out that even in the best of times, it isn't easy for someone like me to make a living. Later, when I finished the novel, I realized how prescient that sentence turned out to be. For it isn't easy for anyone to make a living, let alone a fox who lives on the shadows at the edge of civilization and the wilderness. But at this point, I had no idea where this book was going. This is a dreadful state of affairs for people who like to outline, such as my husband. Why don't you make some bullet points? He said helpfully. I can't, I replied. I might as well keep on writing because I'm discovering the story as it's being written. Which was very true. I kept on typing, and the fox in my head went on to say, I exist as either a small canid with thick fur, pointed ears, and neat black feet, or a young woman. Neither are safe forms in a world run by men. Frankly, I'd prefer to look like someone's grandmother. That would at least give me some dignity appropriate to my years. Ha ha, I thought. These problems are all very interesting. How indeed did the foxes survive? And by this point, page 2, I had already decided that this was my next novel. Never mind that I had no idea what came next, although it struck me that this fox had an agenda. By this time, my children had come home from school. Why are you laughing, Mummy? One of them asked. Because I'm getting a lot of work done, I said. But you've only written 2 pages. And I tried to explain it wasn't the quantity, but rather the feeling that those pages inspired in me, the sensation that I had just placed my foot on a new road that led to somewhere possibly exciting. There is a Chinese belief that ghosts and foxes are particularly active during times of chaos, like now. And as I wrote, it became clear to me that the book should be set in 1908, in the dying years of the Qing dynasty, the last imperial Chinese dynasty. It was a time of great uncertainty, after which China would be plunged into revolution and civil war. Northeast China, or Manchuria, was prey to the ambitions of Russia and Japan, as well as local warlords. And as my fox said later in the novel, foxes are naturally drawn to trouble. Some say that's because we are the cause of it, but the truth is that chaos is always interesting and often profitable. In fact, while writing this novel, I went down quite a few rabbit holes myself. I wasn't the only one either. In Chinese literature, many famous scholars were obsessed with foxes. During the Ming and Qing dynasties, from the 1600s onwards, there was a craze for stories about them. It's a bit like Twilight in the early 2000s, when everyone wanted to read about vampires. And in writing historical fiction, I often think, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Although I hope that we can at least today skip the chaos and revolution, hoping. But there were even a few unusual historical novels, books which claim to be written by actual foxes. In the rare book collection of the Beijing University Library, for example, there is an incomplete handwritten book called Journey to the East, or 东游记. That is the title. The title itself is actually a play on the famous story, The Monkey King, which was called 西游记, which is Journey to the West. And the very odd subtitle of this handwritten book says, "This is narrated by the Hu Xian and cautiously collected by the all-happy brothel." And the book itself is written with many unknown Chinese characters, mostly wrong combinations of parts and radicals. And since prostitutes used to worship fox spirits, it is possible that this book was written through spirit writing via planchette by courtesans in a brothel. And the wrong characters might be attributed to their lack of education, or perhaps it was written by actual foxes who couldn't spell. So the existence of this actual strange book echoes how I felt when I was writing The Foxwife. When I began it, the voice of the fox, which is one of the narrators, simply took over. It had lots of opinions on everything from appraising antique wine cups to burning down other people's houses. And she also tries very hard to be good, which raises the question of what is good to a non-human creature. The word hu itself, meaning fox, is a homophone for another name, hu, which was used for barbarians. And this is interesting because there are a lot of parallels between foxes and foreigners. For example, foxes are described as people who aren't real people, but beasts pretending to be humans. They're strangely attractive and they have an odd scent, all of which smacks of xenophobia. And from another angle, the stories about foxes are always from the male point of view. It is a scholar who tames a foxwoman, often by marrying her and having her bear him sons, who then prove to be clever enough to do well in the imperial exams. What is it with this obsession with exams? And it makes you wonder, if you were a fox, why would you ever put up with this? But finally, this ended up being a book about love. My favorite Jane Austen novel is actually Persuasion, because it speaks to old loves and that yearning sensation of what might have been. The other narrator of the book, a 63-year-old detective named Bao, so, I managed to get my old guy in after all, is reminded of his lost first love. And my husband says that The Foxwife could be considered an old people's love story about the love of your youth, about missed opportunities and the last chance to make it up. There are so many layers of meaning about foxes and their role in our world. As a famous scholar Ji Yun said, humans and things are different species, and foxes lie between humans and things. Darkness and light take different paths, and foxes lie between darkness and light. Between darkness and light lies the world of stories filled with possibilities. It is a journey that has led me to very unexpected and surprisingly wonderful places, from reading the backs of cornflake packets to writing novels and to even narrating my own audiobooks. That is a whole other talk, which, which I'd be happy to answer questions about as well, and to meeting wonderful fellow writers and readers like all of you. I hope you'll enjoy this journey with me. Thank you.
Thank you, Yangsze. So, following up on the last thing you said, I listened to your book and was enthralled by the narrative's voice. And then I discovered that it was yours. And I never wanted you to stop reading. It was okay if the story ended, but I wanted you to keep talking. So could you talk to us a bit about your experience narrating The Foxwife, and Also, as you read it, did you hear things you wanted to change?
Oh, that's a great question, actually. Um, yes, so, I sort of stumbled into narrating my audiobook by accident because I actually, when I started writing, I didn't know that there was such a thing as audiobooks. And so when my first novel came up, my editor said, and by the way, there will be an audiobook. And I was like, oh. And then I said, who's going to read it? Because my first novel was set in Malaysia and there was a lot of different Chinese dialects in it. And I also thought, nobody's going to read this book anyway, except my family and friends who, if the names are mispronounced, they just might kill me. So then I asked my publisher, like, who is going to read this? They're like, don't worry, we'll find a voice actor. Because most of the time for fiction, they tend to use voice actors because they're better, they're more professional. And I said, if you don't have anyone, could I audition to read? And they're like, do you have any experience? And I said, no. I don't know what I was thinking, but like I said, I just didn't think anyone was going to read this book. And so they're like, okay, you can come in and we'll give you an audition. So I went to New York to visit my publisher and they said, we'll give you a sound audition. And so they brought me to a studio and they were like, okay, fine, you can read your book. But it was really a wonderful experience. I ended up reading all three of my audiobooks. I got a lot of good advice. So the first time I read it, I actually had they had a producer and an engineer. And later on, they're like, you can just do this by yourself. But they were giving me a number of pointers. One is try not to have too much dairy before you read your audiobook. And I was like, okay, thanks. And the other thing was that the producer told me, please don't wear any noisy clothing. And I said, what do you mean by noisy clothing? And she said, well, they had an aging rock star come in to read his memoirs. And she said he was wearing leather pants and a lot of jewelry. And he squeaked like a sofa. And I was like, oh, okay. I will remember not to bring my, I said, how about yoga pants? Is that okay? And she's like, yeah, it's okay. So, but I did enjoy it. It is actually quite a strenuous affair to read a book. I didn't know this either. And what they will do is that they will book you studio time for about a week. So it's 8 hours of reading a day because, as you said, people make mistakes. Beforehand, like the month before, I was always like, I will wear a scarf and I will not get sick because they're paying studio time. And I don't want to use up the studio time. And so when I went in, when I started, they actually have the book printed out. But lately, they just ask you to bring in an iPad so that you can scroll soundlessly without flipping the pages. Have I found things that I want to change? Yes, sometimes I do. And I think that makes it a lot easier because you can abridge things as you want to. The other thing I didn't realize when I first started reading was that I made a lot of voices for the characters. And I didn't understand that you didn't have to do this. Because I was reading the book, and my first book had a lot of old men in it. So I was, the cook. And I was doing this for a long time. And then halfway, the producer said, she's like, it's so nice that you're doing voices because, most people don't. And I thought, oh, I wish I'd known that. But the engineer had also told me, he said, don't do too many voices because you will blow out your voice. So I could go on, but I'll stop here so that you can answer the questions.
Thank you. One of your particularly interesting characters is a somewhat bumbling detective Bao who could hear truth from lies. How did you decide on this character and storyline?
Oh, okay, so that was another accidental thing. So, by the way, one should always write outlines. And so when my children were in school, I was telling them, for your history essay, you need an outline. And they're like, Mummy, you don't have an outline. So they just don't pay any attention to me. But I wrote chapter 2, and the words, the detective, appeared on my screen. And I was like, oh yeah, there's a detective in this book. So I was really excited about that. And as I was writing, actually, I was listening to NPR, and a certain public person was on the radio, and I was like, you probably know who this is. This person is lying. I can hear that this person is lying. I can hear it. I'm sure that maybe 50% of the American population also realize this. But it really struck me that you can tell a lot from someone's voice. And actually, the other thing is that there was another NPR segment on the fact that we stopped using our hearing as much as we used to. But people are incredibly accurate about guessing, someone's age, their height, where they're from their voice. And so I thought about that and I started writing about a detective who could hear truth from lies. But I'm also a very slow writer. It takes me about 4 years to write my books. It's not a very profitable exercise. But while I was writing this, and when I turned in my novel, I think Netflix has a series about a detective who can hear truth from lies as well. And that came out when I'd submitted my book. And my husband was like, I told you to hurry up. Because it's come out, someone else has something similar. I was like, oh, I'm sorry. Slow.
So as research for the story, I understand that you toured many famous historical garden villas, which influenced The Foxwife and the vivid imagery throughout the book. Can you tell us about what you learned on the tours?
Yes, and actually I shall have to stop myself. Otherwise you'll get a 20-minute lecture on the ancient gardens of China. But for those of you who love plants, and I do too, it is super, super interesting because I went to Suzhou, Hangzhou, which is where these ancient gardens of the literati were. And what they were is worlds within worlds. I took a lot of pictures and I wish I could share them with you. And some of these gardens were more than 1,000 years old. They had been kept in the same families. Very few of them remain. I think less than 100 remain. But when I went to visit them, it also struck me that they were also sort of prisons, because the wealthy women of the time could not leave the house. And it is only by walking in these gardens, which have miniature lakes, miniature ponds, collections of rocks, to look at mountains, that people would not be free to go and look at themselves. It was super, super interesting, as well as the number of plants and ancient roses and lotuses. I'll stop myself here before I go on to talk about plants. It was very interesting.
So you talked a little bit about Chinese folk tales, and I was wondering, I know you did some research, but did you grow up with these tales? Were they mostly based on your stories based on your research and the tales, or how did that come together?
So the wonderful thing about writing fiction is that all your hobbies become research. So I got to read about the things I'd always liked, interesting stories. And, many stories are also told to me by my grandparents or people sitting around when I was young. And then I did a tremendous amount of research into foxes, which I'll stop myself from going to. But one of the things that I did read was old first-person eyewitness accounts of encounters with foxes. And they're from China and Japan. And they're very disjointed. They're very strange. From a couple hundred years ago, there's like one, I was walking on a mountain path and this man appeared. They are so odd that they actually feel real. In the way that, when someone tells you something, it's a little too perfect, you think, I don't really believe that this happened. But with the fox stories, I felt like this disjointedness, this kind of fragmented feeling feels very real. And so in the novel, there are a lot of sub-stories about foxes, and many of them are actual stories from these first-person accounts. So that's like an Easter egg.
Thank you. So you have written 3 very successful novels, one of which was a Netflix series. Can we expect a 4th, and will your mother be upset because there are ghosts in it?
Yes, well, I'm working on my 4th novel, and I'm writing very slowly. It is about plants. As I said, one's hobbies become one's research. And I'm very interested, actually, in It's about ginseng, and you know, my husband was like, "You can't tell people that you're writing about ginseng. That sounds dreadfully boring." Um, but I've always been struck by how that is ginseng as a plant is one that has captivated East Asia. It is a very important plant. It also happens to look like a person. It is like the Oriental mandrake in many ways, and so that's why I was thinking about writing. I don't know how my mother will feel about it because it's actually about changelings. You know, the idea there, the idea that a child could be made from a ginseng root. And it brings up, I think, to me, a lot of interesting questions of what do you expect from your children? Why do they exist? Because ginseng as a medicine is taken as a tonic and to preserve your life. And anyway, you can go a long way with that. So I think if I don't know what my mom's going to say, but.
Well, thank you very much. That was wonderful.
Thank you very much for having me.